Tennessee Titans rookie pass rusher Femi Oladejo is freaking out at training camp, and it has a chance to completely change what the Titans are capable of this season. I'll explain on today's edition of Locked On Titans.
You are Locked On Titans, your daily Tennessee Titans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Titans podcast. I am your host, Tyler Rowland. Titans fans, on today's show, we're going to look at the latest risers and fallers through the second week of Tennessee Titans training camp. We're going to start with all the players that are doing a great job so far, including Femi Oladejo, who is freaking out at Titans training camp. We'll also talk about some people who aren't playing their best, including two veterans on the offensive line who I'm a bit worried about. Finally, we'll talk about a recent report from ESPN saying that the Tennessee Titans are open to free agent additions on the defensive side of the ball. I'll tell you what names I'm most interested in. Before we dive into all of it, do want to thank you for making Locked On Titans your first listen each and every day. Remember, Monday through Friday, Tennessee Titans content all year round, always for free. Make sure that you get subscribed, stay subscribed. It's your team every day. Speaking of every day, shout out to my everydayers out there tuning in Monday through Friday. Couldn't do it without you guys. If you aren't an everydayer, you need to be one. There's a reason. This has been the #1 Tennessee Titans podcast in the world for multiple years running, and we are in a stretch of 13 straight days of content. On tomorrow's show, I'm going to look ahead to joint practice against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Wednesday, we have a Titans practice. Then we have that joint practice. I'm going to be here breaking down all of that. And then our first Tennessee Titans football game of the year will be happening this weekend. Make sure that you stay locked in here with me on the Locked On Titans podcast. But we got to talk about the risers, the Titan ups from week 2 of Tennessee Titans training camp. And when I started to make my list, a lot of rookies on the list. And we start with Femi Oladejo, the Tennessee Titans second round pick this year. Desperately need help in the pass rush department, the Tennessee Titans do. And Femi Oladejo was a guy who I was a little bit, let's say, conservative about what his impact could be early on. I tried to, remain optimistically skeptical of what Femi could be out of the gate for the Titans. Coming out of college, out of UCLA, he was an off-ball linebacker for most of his career, so transitioning to the NFL level was hard enough, but changing positions, and a position like edge rusher that is so technique-oriented, your handwork, your pass rush moves, developing all of that when you've really worked on none of it so far until he got to the Senior Bowl and started working individually as he was switching positions. Like, Femi hasn't had a real opportunity to be what the Titans are asking him to be. So I thought early on the only true expectations we could have for Femi was to be part of the rotation on early downs. I thought he'd back up Lorenzo Carter early on in the season as an early down edge setter against the run, but probably wouldn't be able to help much in the pass. But so far throughout training camp, rave reviews for Femi Oladejo. We heard early in camp he was ahead of the curve. Now you start to read the practice reports from multiple different sources every single day, and it's like Femi Oladejo was terrible early on in his one-on-one pass rush. He couldn't beat anybody. It was a terrible session. Looked out of his depth. Now, last practice, Teron Davenport reports Femi Oladejo won all of his one-on-one matchups. Was obvious. You hear about the team reports, Femi Oladejo knocking down a pass. Femi Oladejo got pressure in the backfield. A would-be sack for Femi. Like, his impact on the defense. Now, they need it because Lorenzo Carter retired suddenly, and he was that big, physical, early down edge rusher that the Titans could count on as a veteran who's done it before. So now that they don't necessarily have that guy, Femi has to take a step forward. It is necessary now. But here's the thing. At 6'3", 260 pounds, with super long arms, freak athleticism, explosion off the line of scrimmage. I have faith that Femi Oladejo's physicality on its own will allow him to, from day one, be an early down starter for the Titans now. But if he's already starting to make an impact against a Titans offensive line that should be significantly better than the Tennessee Titans pass rush group, which we're going to talk about the offensive line in the Titan down section of today's show. But if Femi Oladejo is already making an impact against this offensive line as a pass rusher, with what I feel very confident he can do against the run, Femi Oladejo was one of my X-factor players that I've talked about throughout the offseason for the Titans. If the Titans are going to hit their peak, the best that they can possibly be as a football team in 2025, it's going to be because Femi Oladejo had a, maybe not quite as good, but had somewhat of a freak 2.0 season, like a Javon Curse coming out of college. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be to that level, defensive rookie of the year, 14 sacks. I'm not saying it's quite going to be to that level. But if Femi could have a freak 2.0 sort of jump as a rookie for the Titans, it would be absolutely massive for not only the potential of the defense, but for the potential of the entire team. And I don't think, again, that makes Femi a 14, 15 sack guy out of the gate. But if he could get 8 to 10 sacks out of the gate for this team, that would be well and above what my expectations were, Femi. And he's been excellent throughout this last week of camp. But we also got to talk about Kevin Winston, folks. Kevin Winston is a guy so scared. On Sunday, Kevin Winston leaves practice early, but we find out it's just management. It's not an injury. He's fine. No matter where you look, you're going to find positive Kevin Winston talk. No matter where you look. And now, again, like with Femi, this is the thing about the Tennessee Titans draft class, and maybe we have an opportunity at some point to have a larger conversation, and maybe we're having it right now, as a matter of fact. But we talked about how these two picks for the Titans, Femi Oladejo, who's a converted off-ball linebacker with great upside, and then Kevin Winston, who showed first-round talent during his playing career at Penn State, but is coming off an ACL tear. Both of these guys make this draft class maybe not as great right away year one, but the Titans could have multiple star players from this draft class down the line. Well, if Femi is already freaking out in camp, and Kevin Winston already looks like maybe the best safety on the team, Amani Hooker's a pretty good player, though. So I'm just saying, but Winston has factored every single practice, makes big plays, makes noticeable plays that get in the reports and get his name mentioned. And just, even when it's not anything crazy, it's just Kevin Winston, once again, gotta make sure that his name is in there because Kevin Winston is so noticeable. If Kevin Winston is so important, I said this yesterday, is he's so important that they're giving him management days because they want to make sure that he's good to go, because that shows just how critical they think his role within the defense could be this year and just how important to the team. So if you get Femi Oladejo way ahead of the learning curve and Kevin Winston way ahead of the health curve, and you add them to this defense that was already good, I don't think it's great like some people think, but good, massive. So major tighten up for the Titans. Two huge draft picks in the second round, in the third round, but also you go to the offensive line, you talk about a rookie as well with Jackson Slater. As the physicality is ratcheted up in training camp and they've done more run period and 7-on-9, Jackson Slater has continued to factor. There was an awesome video the Titans put out from practice of somebody busting a run open. I think it was Jefferson or Mims, one of the two. But Jackson Slater was on a kickout block, number 64, and makes a critical kickout block to create the seal that the running back burst through. And it's like, man, everywhere you turn, you hear about Jackson Slater and how good he's been early on. And look, with what we're about to discuss on the offensive line, the fact that I'm giving a major tighten up to Jackson Slater, who plays guard in the interior, and a major tighten up to Jalen Duncan. Jalen Duncan has been one of the stars of training camp, the third-year player, offensive tackle. The fact that I'm giving major love to Slater and Duncan, Duncan's been incredible in the one-on-ones. The fact that I'm giving major credit to those guys on the offensive line is great news considering where we're about to go with the conversation. But I also want to give some props to guys who we've talked a lot about before. Bryce Oliver, I've talked about him in a bunch throughout the week. Basically a lock to be wide receiver 6 for the Titans. James Prochet, who is doing everything he can to keep Xavier Restrepo out of the way. But the thing is, Restrepo did move up to get second-team reps at one point during practice this week. So you could say Restrepo is a tighten up. It's just James Prochet and Bryce Oliver have been so good that they are above Xavier Restrepo, even if Restrepo is now above the Jaquan Jacksons and the Mason Kinseys and those types of players. Even if Restrepo was moved up all the way to the point where he's wide receiver 8 from the bottom of the rung as an undrafted free agent, Prochet and Oliver have been so good that they're still above him. So you could call all of them risers while still holding to the point I said earlier this week of, I'm worried about Xavier Restrepo's roster spot. It's just because Prochet and Oliver have been so good, and that's continued and even gotten better. Prochet was the headline guy for one of Jim Wyatt's articles earlier this week. You know what I mean? Like, he's been that good. And I do want to give some love to some depth on the defense. Ali Gay at edge rusher had a pick 6 during practice at one point in time. Ali Gay is a guy who, behind Arden Key, could be very, very important as a long edge rusher. And then Cam Horsley, the undrafted free agent nose tackle. The Titans got rid of Keandre Coburn because they felt pretty confident in some of their younger nose tackle options, and Horsley remains a guy who I'm very interested in, who I think is that undrafted free agent guy who could take that jump. So that's my Tighten Up section from the second week of training camp. Now we do got to talk about some of the Tighten Downs. Today's episode is sponsored by Yahoo Fantasy. Look, it's the best time of year, folks. The NFL kickoff is almost here, and that means fantasy football season is back in full swing. And this year, Yahoo Fantasy is turning up things with a fantasy football experience like never before. This year, maybe some of you are going to be playing on Yahoo Fantasy. And even if you're not in the Locked On Titans Fantasy League, you should be playing on Yahoo Fantasy too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making their millionth league. Look, Yahoo has been doing this for a long time, and they have really made the process incredible. And to celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days throughout August. To kick it off, they just dropped Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, a killer new way to play fantasy football on Yahoo, where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated each week until there's only one team left standing. With the season around the corner, now's the time to get your league together and give this new mode a try. If you're more into the classics, you could still play in head-to-head private leagues or join a public league. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. Titans fans, let's continue today's edition of the Locked On Titans podcast. We just talked about my Tighten Ups, the good from week 2 of Tennessee Titans training camp. But now I want to get into some of the folks who I think might be struggling a little bit, or some of the areas of concern that I have, my Titan Downs from week 2 of Tennessee Titans training camp. As a reminder, the Titans are reportedly open to defensive free agents. I'm going to go over who makes sense. And remember, later this week, tomorrow, I'm going to be doing a preview of joint practices against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Then the Titans have practice on Wednesday. They have the joint practice on Thursday. I'm going to be here to break those down after those practices happen. Friday, a bonus episode with a preview of the Tennessee Titans' first preseason game of the year on Saturday night. And then I'm going to be here Saturday night going live to break it all down. And then we'll get into our normal week of Locked On Titans next week, where I'll have multiple shows for you going into week 2 of the preseason. But with that being said, we got to start on the offensive line. And I've been pretty vocal about my concerns with Dan Moore. And Dan Moore has lost some battles. We saw in some of the reporting that, a loss to Arden Key to end the call-it period for the Titans at the end of Sunday's practice. There have been reports out there that are positive for Dan Moore. A couple of reps, he's able to latch on to guys recently because of, I got to tell you guys the honest truth. What happens sometimes, in my opinion, is I kind of start beating a drum. Hey, what's up with Dan Moore? I'm concerned about Dan Moore. I'm worried about Dan Moore. And then some of the people at practice are like, why would we be concerned about Dan Moore? Dan Moore's doing fine. Well, great. That's great information to have. Some have come out who report on practice. I know my guy Easton Freeze has been very positive about Dan Moore. Some saying, hey, no noise is good noise with Dan Moore. There is some positives in there. I just think with how good in the spotlight that has been shined on Peter Skoronski and J.C. Latham, well, if the Titans' offensive line is getting beat in certain circumstances where the first team is out there, who's the one getting beat? And I think while I'll give Dan Moore a Titan down, I think answers are starting to come out a little bit more. And a guy like Kevin Zietler, the 35-year-old free agent signing from the Detroit Lions, who is penned in, I would say, to be the Titans' starting right guard, he is another Titan down. He's been struggling mightily. I think Kevin Zietler has struggled with the physicality of the Titans' interior defensive line, but here's one thing to keep in mind with a guy like Kevin Zietler. He's 35 years old. He didn't really do much in the offseason program for the Titans. Probably going to take a little bit longer for the 35-year-old to get ramped up. Probably a little early in the process for us to get worried about the 35-year-old stalwart veteran who's one of the top 15, top 10 guards in the NFL last year. It's not time to worry about Kevin Zietler, but we're not being honest. Again, every time, this is the way internet culture works. If I say Cam Ward had a bad practice, then in some people's minds, that means what I'm saying is Cam Ward is going to be bad. If I say Kevin Zietler has had a rough week of practice in the second week of practice for the Titans, first padded week of practice, that does not mean I'm saying Kevin Zietler is going to be bad for the Titans this year. Like, people online in our general society struggle so hard. I love pancakes. Why do you hate waffles? That's not what I said. Cam Ward had a bad practice. Doesn't mean I think Cam Ward's going to be a bust. The jump to what the long-term consequences of a single statement in real time, just the way that happens blows my mind. And as someone who makes content and talks, I could say one thing and it gets twisted into so many other different things. But we have to be honest. We have to tell the truth. The defense has won training camp significantly, and the defensive line has been better against the offensive line than I was hoping for. And a big part of that is Dan Moore and Kevin Zietler. And Corey Levin, I'm sure as a backup, is struggling. I thought Nick Holes talked about this, saying, going with the ones, going against Jeff and stuff, it's going to be tough for Corey Levin. But hey, if Lloyd Cushenberry is coming off an Achilles injury, who knows when he's going to be ready? The Titans are going to need Corey Levin. So if Corey Levin and Kevin Zietler and Dan Moore are having subpar camps, that's not great news. Now, I think Levin's doing all right. And Dan Moore, again, there's been more positive conversation around Dan Moore, so maybe it's not quite as bad as it seems. But Kevin Zietler certainly hasn't been great so far. And again, overall, we can, this and that. But you look at the reports, you look at the conversation coming out of practice, you look at how well the defense is done, the defensive line is done. There's just no way to reconcile all of that without admitting that maybe some Titans starting offensive linemen have not been playing incredible. And I think we know exactly who those people are. Now, to the level to which different people are willing to admit that, that's the conversation that we're having. But I have to give a Titan down to start, at least, with Kevin Zietler and Dan Moore on the offensive line. And I would stay on the offensive line and tell you that Ali Udoh, who I thought had a great chance to be the primary swing tackle on this team, John Ojukwu, who basically was the primary swing tackle for the Titans last year on this team, both of them as depth offensive tackles have been squarely beat out so far by Jalen Duncan. Duncan has been significantly better than any of the other tackles outside of the starters. We talked about Jalen Duncan and Jackson Slater, and are we potentially talking about two starters on the Titans offensive line in 2026? Jackson Slater and Kevin Zietler spot, which I think is what Titans fans should be hoping for right now. You would hope that the Titans could find a starting interior offensive lineman out of a sixth-round pick like Jackson Slater, and I think that's 100% possible, just not this year. But Zietler as a placeholder for 1 year for Jackson Slater next year, I think is wholly possible. And if Zietler does struggle for some reason, which this ain't the Detroit Lions offensive situation, folks, this is the Tennessee Titans. If Zietler does struggle and he's 35, gets banged up, we could see a lot of Jackson Slater this year at starting guard. Also, if Dan Moore, look, I know, but the Pittsburgh Steelers drafted offensive tackles in the first round in back-to-back seasons so that they could get rid of Dan Moore. And now the Titans think he's going to be an answer for years to come. I'm not as certain of that as the Titans are, it seems. And potentially Jalen Duncan going into his last year of his contract after a blow-up year from Bill Callahan's tutelage, I don't think it's crazy to think that maybe Jalen Duncan could supplant Dan Moore by this time next year. Now, we're far a ways away from that, but if Duncan continues to rise and Dan Moore plays as I expect, I don't think it would be out of the realm of possibility that would happen. Also on the offensive line, Blake Hance. Blake Hance has missed the whole week with a calf. I expected him to be the Titans' number one backup offensive lineman. Can play tackle, can play guard, and he hasn't been out there. And if your best ability is availability, Hance hasn't been out there, and it's allowed Jackson Slater to maybe take a step forward. And then what's the point of keeping Blake Hance if we think Jackson Slater is better anyway? Puts him in a tough spot. I still think Hance has a spot on this roster, but he needs to find a way to get back out on the field ASAP. Staying on offense, I think Josh Wiley has been a guy who is a Titan down. Now, I think you read reports like Jim Wyatt said Wiley's gotten more consistent in week 2 in training camp. But DMR has been one of the big standouts of training camp from the low ranks of the roster. And I read a report recently where DMR and Thomas Odukoye are getting a ton of run with the first team offense. Odukoye is a big-bodied blocker. When you think about Chigakonkwo, Gunnar Helm kind of being in between that, Josh Wiley being more like Gunnar Helm, DMR being a little bit more like Chig, but a little bit more big and stocky. Odukoye is that Nick Vanette, Jeff Swaim blocking style tight end. So I think Odukoye's unique skill set amongst the tight ends, and then David Martin Robinson's skill set overlap with Chigakonkwo make them potentially guys who could take roster spots away from Josh Wiley. If 4 tight ends are kept and Josh Wiley isn't one of them, that would be a bit of a surprise, but I think it would be less surprising now because Josh Wiley just hasn't been quite as good as the rookie underneath him, and then doesn't have the unique skill set he can provide to the room like DMR and Odukoye can. On defense, I didn't really have a ton of Titan downs on the defensive side of the ball. I think the defense has been really good in the first couple of weeks of training camp, and especially in week 2. They've dominated some practices. The offense has not been good, so it's hard to find Titan downs on defense. But I would just say this. Otis Reese had a chance to maybe be a starter. I think that's out the window. James Williams is going to be the starter, and if it's not him, it's going to be Cedric Gray. And then Mike Brown. And listen, I'm a Mike Brown defender. I'm not saying Mike Brown is a Titan down because he's played poorly, but Kevin Winston has played so well. And it's clear that Kevin Winston, Xavier Woods, and Amani Hooker are the top 3 safeties, where Mike Brown has been pushed up into that role at times in recent years. And maybe in Mike Brown's mind, he's probably like, I could be the 3rd safety on this team. I've played well enough in that opportunity last year to do that. He's not that anymore. So a Titan down from the perspective of there's not really much Mike Brown can do. He's never going to get that 3rd safety opportunity without injuries ever again. But with that being said, again, a report came out from ESPN on Monday that the Tennessee Titans are open to free agent additions on the defensive side of the ball. I want to talk about where those additions need to happen and what players are still out there that make sense. Today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or you're planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, spending, all in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. For me, when I first got Monarch, I didn't realize just how much I was spending on online shopping. Now I can budget smarter. Also, now that I'm getting into investing, having everything all in one place makes things super, super easy and super, super efficient. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. Titans fans, let's cap off today's edition of the Locked On Titans podcast. We did our winners and losers, our Titan ups and Titan downs coming out of training camp. Now I want to get into a report that happened on Monday from ESPN. I think it was ESPN's Jeremy Fowler. He had a couple of different things to say, obviously talking about Cam Ward and talking about the defense and the roster and all of that. Checked out training camp, but I thought the most interesting thing coming out of the report was a little throwaway comment about potential free agents. And Jeremy Fowler said this, quote, Tennessee is open to adding on defense via free agency. Pass rusher and corner would be 2 spots to watch. And I agree with Jeremy Fowler there. You talk about cornerback, L'Jarius Sneed's health is obviously a question. I think Darrell Baker Jr. has done a really good job in training camp. Jarvis Brownlee Jr. has been one of the better players on the defensive side of the ball, and Roger McCreary looks absolutely locked in for his contract year. So you have three good corners, and then Snead, if he is able to come back in a good spot. But after that, it's one veteran and Owuwarriye. There we go. Owuwarriye, who's near 30, but then you have a ton of undrafted free agent guys who they brought in this year, like Marcus Harris was drafted, but Jamari Harris and Jalen Kimber, and then, of course, you have Gabe Jeudy-Lawley, who's another guy who I just don't know if you can count on in year two, the undrafted free agent out of Tennessee, Gabe Jeudy-Lawley. If the Titans can't count on Gabe Jeudy-Lawley and they are more concerned behind the scenes about L'Jarius Sneed's health and viability for this season than they say publicly, then I think a cornerback does make a ton of sense. But again, an edge rusher. The Titans lose Lorenzo Carter. They bring in Jihad Ward. Jihad Ward is more of a tweener guy like Draymond Jones, who can rush on the inside, who can play on the outside, do a couple of different things. But if the Titans wanted another big physical edge rusher on the outside who isn't a tweener, I think edge is a spot they could still look at. And again, we got to get into, well, what names would make sense there? Well, you look at edge rusher, and the name that I continue to say is Jadeveon Clowney. 9.5 sacks just 2 years ago with the Baltimore Ravens. Who was on that coaching staff? Dennard Wilson. So I think Dennard Wilson would know how to best use Jadeveon Clowney, how to best deploy Jadeveon Clowney, could get the best out of Jadeveon Clowney. Again, I know there are Titans fans who are scorned lovers from the 2020 experience of Jadeveon Clowney. He didn't talk great about the franchise after he left either, and some people, for those pride reasons, will say never. But I don't really care about pride. I care about the Titans winning as many football games as they possibly can, and I think bringing in Jadeveon Clowney is the best option at edge rusher for the Tennessee Titans. But there's some other options out there as well, and one of the ones that gets mentioned here in this article by Jeremy Fowler, he says, quote, one name to watch, veteran defensive end Preston Smith. And I think that is an interesting name. Preston Smith is kind of in the same boat as Jadeveon Clowney, as Zadarius Smith as well, who I think is a name that could make sense. Preston Smith had 4.5 sacks last year for Green Bay and the Pittsburgh Steelers as a combo. He had 2.5 with Green Bay and then 2 with Pittsburgh. The 3 seasons before that, though, 2021, 2022, and 2023, he had at least 8 sacks in all of those seasons. His best year was with Green Bay in 2019 when he had 12 sacks. But obviously an older player. I mean, he's no spring chicken. He's 32 years old. He's going to turn 33 in November. But a guy who knows how to win, knows what he's doing. He could help out a guy like Femi Oladejo and just give you more in the rotation. Look, the Titans don't have top-tier elite pass rushers in their pass rush rotation. So maybe the best way to handle that is to have as big and as healthy of a rotation as you can, even if it means that you take on some of these older guys who can't play down to down. And I think Zadarius Smith is another guy in a very similar vein. He is 32 years old, going to turn 33 in September, played with multiple teams last year, Cleveland and Detroit, but had 9 sacks overall. Now, Zadarius Smith isn't a guy like Preston Smith who's going to be able to play down after down after down all the time as a starter, but as part of a rotation that you can deploy along with Arden Key and Femi Oladejo and Draymond Jones. Now you have 4 guys. Like right now you have Arden Key, you have Draymond Jones, and Jones is a guy who you can rush on the interior quite a bit. And then you have Femi Oladejo, who we're all excited about. But again, you got to keep that optimistic view of Femi Oladejo at least on the chain a little bit until we get into some games here. So adding in another veteran who knows what to do and can kind of just give you that part of your rotation. Now you have 4 good rotational players in your pass rush to go along with Jeffrey Simmons, Tavondre Sweat, and Sebastian Joseph Day. And then you could add Draymond Jones in there because he can be an interior rusher as well. I think that makes a ton of sense. So edge rusher is the top spot. I'm glad that the name that got mentioned for the Titans is an edge who makes sense. Preston Smith would be a great addition, even if I think Clowney is the better one. But Matthew Judon, Carl Lawson, if you wanted another tweener like Jihad Ward, DeMarcus Walker could make some sense. But I think the Jihad Ward is where the Titans would go if they wanted a DeMarcus Walker type. They brought him in. So I think a pure edge like the guys we talked about before makes the most sense. And then cornerback. Again, we talked about cornerback and the reasons why that might be something the Titans would be interested in. Asante Samuel Jr. coming off injury, of course, but still only 25 years old. I would take that risk. Stephon Gilmore is the other side of that, a consistent guy, but he's 34 years old. Rosal Douglas is maybe an in-between of those groups. Douglas, more of a veteran, close to 30. I think he's 31, coming off a couple of seasons with the Buffalo Bills, but Rosal Douglas has had some good snaps in recent years, just veteran depth. So cornerback, edge, I agree. Those are the two spots the Titans need to be looking at. Those are the names that make the most sense and why they make the most sense. Will the Titans make some of those moves? I think we're going to see these joint practices. If the Titans aren't happy with what they see in their joint practices against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week, I think they could make some of these moves as they start to churn the roster going into next week, into preseason week 2. But again, remember, tomorrow I'm going to preview the 2 practices ahead for the Titans this week, Wednesday and Thursday's joint practice against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'll really focus in on that because Wednesday I'll be covering the practice that happened on Wednesday that's just the Titans, and then Thursday we'll be covering the joint practices that happened. So tomorrow's show, we'll preview all that. Make sure that you're here with me. Again, get subscribed, stay subscribed. It's your team every day. As always, though, I am your host, Tyler Rowland, and this was Locked On Titans.